Hello everyone, my name is Helle. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Babylonian Poetry. I am the translator of Gilgamesh. I translated into Danish, or Senegal. I translated into English, the version that came out of the Yale University Press. And I am very, very happy to be welcoming Selena Wisnom, the Heritage of the Middle East at Leicester University. Her research focuses on Babylonian literature and relation. And she's the author of Weapons of Words, Intertextual Competition, Babylonian Poetry. It's written also a series of plays about three of the great Assyrian kings, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal. Next to her is Walid Siti. He is a painter and visual artist born in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, now living in London. As we will hear more about later, his art is closely engaged with the cultural heritage of Iraq, as well as themes of loss, memory, exile, and nostalgia. This work has been exhibited at, among others, the Met in New York, the British Museum in Wisnom, Albert. Jen Lewis is a poet, playwright, children's author, and translator who teaches poetry at Oxford University. And besides many other excellent volumes of poetry, she is the author of a retelling translation. I have to talk more about that. Of Gilgamesh, entitled Gilgamesh Retold. And last year, she completed a PhD in Goldsmith, University of London, by Oxford University. We'll hear more about other accomplishments later. But just to set the stage, and we all want to be here, this is the 150th anniversary of the lecture, which a young Assyriologist named George Smith first presented the Gilgamesh to the world. So, happy birthday to the modern Gilgamesh as well. George Smith gave this lecture, this momentous lecture in the history of Assyriology at the Society of Biblical Archaeology. That society no longer exists because it merged into the Royal Asiatic Society in 1919. So we are as close to the original venue and the original date as we could. Now, this presentation was, as those of you who know the history of Gilgamesh will be familiar with, this was not just an academic lecture like any other, it was a big event. None other than the sitting Prime Minister at the time, William Gladstone, was in the audience, which gives you an idea of what kind of event that was. No, Prime Minister's here. Right. And the reason, of course, why this was such a momentous discovery is that George Smith had found very precise parallels in the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical story of the flood. But already on that very first date, it emerged that Gilgamesh held interests that were more than just biblical and more than just historical. In his lecture, George Smith drew parallels between the Epic and the stories of Hercules. And when his presentation was done, Gladstone stood up and announced, "I have not come into this room with the purpose of giving a speech," and then, of course, gave a speech in which he, among other things, compared the Epic of Gilgamesh to the epics of Homer. I think a really crisp illustration of the fact that we understand literature best by comparing it to other literature. So already on that very first day of its modern life, Gilgamesh was making its way into the canon, as it were, and being compared to the truly great works of literature. And that was the starting gun for 150 years of reception, translation, adaptation, interpretation, and study. Now, today, despite this being the anniversary of George Smith's lecture, we're not actually going to talk that much about George Smith or Gladstone or any of that. For those of you who are interested in it, there is a wonderful podcast called Thin End of the Wedge for the true Assyriological nerds, in which this event, George Smith's brief, but let's just say eventful life is well summarized. Instead, we're going to be talking about something that I find really interesting about these 150 years of translation and interpretation, which is that Gilgamesh seems to have a unique and enduring power to mean things to its readers on a very personal level, but that also means a very different level. In these 150 years, Gilgamesh has been translated 24 times. It's been made into plays and symphonies and operas and comic books, anime. It gives its name to a very young anime that tweets and Western pants in an out restaurant in London. It has been retold in a variety of media and in a variety of forms. But all of those retellings seem to focus on different themes that are of particular interest to the artist or poet who has carried them out. Gilgamesh has been used to reflect on the fear of death and our longing for immortality. It's been used to reflect on the love between two men, or the loss of a loved one and the process of grief. It's been used to reflect on the burden of community and the burden of leadership. It's been used to reflect on the perhaps inevitable clash between culture and nature, on ecological devastation and on apocalyptic fears as embodied in the history of the flood, and so on and so forth. For one classicist named Andrea Deacon, Gilgamesh is a fellow insomniac. For Star Trek, as Captain Picard, Gilgamesh is a story about finding friendship in adversity, and so on and so forth. So I think this is really a key to Gilgamesh's long success, that it has this almost kaleidoscopic quality. And that is really what I want to focus on tonight. That's why I invited these three local presenters to tease out some of the different things that Gilgamesh can mean to different people. Great. So that is it. Without further ado, I will begin by quickly Gilgamesh, and we can take into Selena. So Gilgamesh is a Mesopotamian story, and perhaps for those who don't know, you can really set up for the stage. What is Mesopotamia? When and where are we at?
Yes, of course. So Mesopotamia is the name that we give to modern day Iraq and Syria. It's Greek for between the rivers, which are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it's home to the fertile crescent, or what is often referred to as the cradle of civilization. So this is where we get the first cities, all of the cultural achievements that follow from that.
Yes. So that's important for Gilgamesh is home to a number of different cultures, the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Syrian. Gilgamesh makes its way well.
Yes, so Mesopotamian history starts really about 3,400 BC. Right. This is also literally where history begins, and it covers a huge time span. The very latest written documents we have in cuneiform culture from Mesopotamia are from 70 AD. So it's 3,500 years of history that this area is witness to. And Gilgamesh developed over a long time span within that. So we see the first stories about Gilgamesh written in Sumerian, which is the very earliest language that we have recorded in the region, probably somewhere in the early 2nd millennium BC. It goes through many different versions in this time. Gilgamesh has been rewritten many times already in history before it gets to us. So when Akkadian speakers come into the region and take over, then they write their own version of Gilgamesh. They take the existing Sumerian stories, they weave them together into what we now have as an epic. And then later in the 2nd millennium, it's reworked yet again into what we now know as the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh, which is what the station is primarily based on. And this is when it reaches its fullest scale. So we have prologue added, we have epilogue added, and the story is really drawn out to its full, most epic extent. So Gilgamesh itself has an extremely long history, and is based on many other stories from Mesopotamia. I think that to us, it's usually the first work of Mesopotamian literature that most of us come across. But it's by no means the only one. It's the most famous one, even within it, with so many other older literature. One of the things that makes it fascinating, because it is itself kind of compilation or celebration of the whole history of Mesopotamian literature, all the different genres and why it's such a case of Babylonian literature for anyone.
I haven't thought about it like that. You're right. I mean, it just almost catalog all other genres. As opposed to you, that Gilgamesh isn't, because Gilgamesh is so celebrated, the other aspects of the village or era aren't really in the same way known today. It's tend to treat it as a bit of a back. That actually comes out extremely vibrant literature.
Yes, I mean the famous story of the flood, of course, which is what Gilgamesh was is so famous for when it was first discovered, and it's one of the things that so strikes people about it now. That was already told in an earlier story that was dedicated just to the flood in Babylonian literature. But what Gilgamesh does is it excerpts that, the end of that story, and puts it as the end of the Gilgamesh story to make its own point about why the flood was important, why it was a turning point in human history. But there are other details earlier in that story that Gilgamesh itself doesn't tell. So it's selecting, reworking, and presenting it as something new.
Just a point of like terminology. Do you call it an epic? I know some scholars like to call it an epic, and some resist that.
I do like calling it an epic. Yeah, I'm happy to. I think, as you say so beautifully in your book, it has an epic feel, right? Regardless of epic being epic is a Greek term. So the reason that some scholars don't like this is because they say, oh, it's anachronistic. The Greeks invented epic, but actually it does fit so closely our ideas of what we expect from an epic. I think it's fine.
I agree. So perhaps you could just give us a brief plot summary. Just what is the story of Gilgamesh?
Yeah, sure. It's about, Gilgamesh is a legendary king of the Sumerian city of Uruk. And he is not the best king, not the most model king, perhaps, shall we say. And his people are not very happy with his rule. So they cry out to the gods and ask the gods to do something about this, to bring Gilgamesh back into line. And they send him a friend called Enkidu, who was created out of a pinch of clay, and the birth goddess throws this pinch of clay down onto the steppe, and a primeval man is created who roams the steppe. And Enkidu is brought to the city. He meets Gilgamesh. They fight, but they turn out to be an equal match, and they become firm friends. And it's really Gilgamesh's friendship with Enkidu that will change him fundamentally forever. They go on various adventures, and these adventures will lead to Enkidu's death. Gilgamesh then has to face, for the first time in his life, the fact that he is mortal and he's going to die, but he doesn't really learn the lesson that he's supposed to, which, well, as my student pointed out the other day, that's quite awful. Human beings don't take so much reality. He doesn't then come to terms with his behavior and change his mind and accept his limits. Instead, he thinks, well, if I'm going to die one day, what can I do? I will try to attain immortality. So he thinks there's one man out there who did achieve this. I'll go and find him and ask him how he did it. He sets out on a further series of adventures, finds this man who's living at the other ends of the earth, asks him what happened, and then he is told the story of flood. Gilgamesh does not attain the life he seeks, needless to say, returns back home to Uruk empty-handed, and the epic is interestingly silent on how he actually handles that, I think. Does he learn his lesson or not? We often assume that he does, but if the text itself doesn't really tell us. So
I'd love to return that to that in a moment, but just if I can interject with one of my favorite things about Gilgamesh is that Gilgamesh has this mirroring structure. It is divided into two stories, as is already evident from the way Selena told it, that midway through the story, Enkidu dies as punishment for the hero's killings of the sacred guardian Humbaba and of the bull of heaven, and that's sort of the midpoint, the emotional midpoint of the story. But there are all sorts of contrasts between the first part and the second part. Like in the first part, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, they travel to the west, and the second, Gilgamesh travels to the east. He comes across a magical jungle protected by this garden of Humbaba in the first part, and then he comes across the garden of the gods in the second part. In the first part, there's a goddess who is deeply attracted to him, in the entire garden of the goddess is revolted by her, and so on and so forth. And I really like, that's one of the things I like doing with Gilgamesh, tracing on how these parallels. I think that's one of the moments when you can see the compositional intelligence of the epic at work, the way it's delicate pattern. But perhaps we could return to this quite mysterious ending. So Gilgamesh has, we've witnessed him be this the tyrant. The gods say about him that there is a storm in his heart. He's gone all through this adventure. He's confronted with his own mortality. Able to achieve eternal life. He comes back to Uruk and he points to the wall of Uruk. And there the story ends. Like, what does that ending mean?
Look at all the. I think one of the great things about Babylon in general, actually, which is capturates so well, is that it never really tells you exactly how to think or what to think. It always, it's very visual in a sense. It's not in a way that it describes things, but it will say, look at this, look at that, and lead you to draw your own conclusions. So this kind of gapping or omission is actually deliberately part of how it works, I think. And the prologue tells us that Gilgamesh saw the deep and attained great wisdom. So by implication, it's there that he learned his lesson somehow. But we don't actually see that. We see him at his lowest point, really. We see him utterly defeated. He's lost the chance to regain his youth because he hasn't managed to eat the plant. He's lost that chance. He's thrown away the tools that he used to go and get the plant, so he can't go and get any more. So it's a really tragic moment that through his own thoughtlessness and his own rashness, he's brought about this. He's put it on himself, and then he just sits down and cries. Gilgamesh sits down and cries, utterly broken by the end, and then yes, we have behold the walls of Uruk. Which gives us a sense that this is something that he's left behind, and that's the only kind of immortality he'll get. What has he built? Which actually for Mesopotamian the great walls of Uruk, maybe not the original ones that he had built, clearly being built and rebuilt and rebuilt, but it's actually City of Uruk.
Yeah, and in a sense, like the walls of Uruk are also compared within the epic itself to the epic itself, as it were. Like the epic likes to liken itself to a monument that is like the walls. So perhaps like seizing of this idea that the walls, because of the way these walls were built in the ancient world, they had to be continuously rebuilt because of the material with which it came. In the sense, it's the same, it's true of the story. The theory only lives on because we're telling it again and again and like making various versions of it, making various interpretations of it. But I really like your point that Gilgamesh in particular, but also Babylonian poetry in general, really has these powerful silences that it works through, and these powerful obscurities that allow for different interpretations. Of course, another one is the nature of the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enki. Is, the emotional core of the epic, the thing that the entire epic turns around. How do you interpret their relation? Like, how do you see the friendship between them?
What a question! What a question! Well, one interpretation that came up actually with my students recently is that really maybe it doesn't matter the fact that it doesn't really specify what exactly the nature of their relationship is, because maybe the point really is the friendship. Whether or not is the relationship sexual or not, but it's really all about how close they are. And shows that everybody needs a friend. It's lonely at the top. You go Gilgamesh, and even somebody like that needs a close companion and somebody to be a kind of mirror to them. So evading your question deliberately.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like there's an Assyriologist named Martin Worthington who he wrote this massive book, 450 pages as far as I remember, about 4 specific lines in the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the thing that he concludes after those 450 pages, he just can't tell one way or another.
Yes.
Which is also why perhaps it's good for students. This opens for the students' engagement with it. Of course, when we're talking about what does the epic mean today, how do we interpret it, one obvious but very difficult question is, what did it mean to the ancient scribes? And I know that I'm posing a practically impossible question, but would you have a stab at answering it all the same?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the great things about Gilgamesh today is that it's so vast that it gives scope for so many different people to see different things in it. But I think that was also true in Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh was an immensely complex figure, as we've seen already. So we can start with the scribes who would be learning to write. Gilgamesh was a core part of the curriculum for children learning to write cuneiform for the first time. So when they're learning to speak Sumerian, by a time when Sumerian is no longer being spoken, they're learning a dead language. School children in Britain are writing that's in instance. And what are they learning to write? They're writing Gilgamesh, and there are stories that are about the expeditions to the forest, for instance, this great monster of the shadows, which probably would have been great fun for them, and maybe that's one reason why they don't break them. We can also speculate about where this story came from in the first place, which is that city, that then the king of the city of Uruk, perhaps the later kings of the same city, or nearby cities such as Ur, would have wanted to link themselves with this mythical ancestor. So some of the same names originated as folk tales. So yeah, more of the great ancestors of kings who were ruling at that time. But then when we think about who else these scribes would have been, they're the educated stratum of Babylonian society, of course, and many of them would have been advisors to powerful figures. And one of the key messages of the epic is that Gilgamesh is not a very good king, and actually he needs the advice of a whole host of people. You know, he needs Enkidu to encourage him to reflect on his behaviour. You know, he has to listen to his mother. He has to listen. He needs directions from all kinds of people that he meets on his travels. He wouldn't really get anywhere if it wasn't for other people. So the scribes who are introducing these and who are carrying on this great tradition, would have quite liked that the message. I think
they are the advisor.
They are the advisor. So it's increasing the value of what they are doing, value of education.
Yeah.
I will say.
And then there's a really key example of that as well, the story of the flood. You know, the king of the gods, and they'll destroy all of humanity with the cataclysmic flood. And then child for not listening to the advice of the other gods.
Yes.
Right? So there's a kind of like, again, it's good to be a scribe, copying Gilgamesh, because it tells you why your job is important.
Yes, exactly. And then there's the kings themselves. So, I mean, Gilgamesh, he's got two sides. He's the equivalent of the ancient Babylonian superhero. He's a authority warrior, a mighty adventurer, somebody who needs to be sung of throughout history. But also, he's not really a hero to be emulated. At the beginning of the terrible king, people don't think he's doing a very good job. He, as we said, he's constantly getting himself into trouble if it weren't for other people telling him what to do. He doesn't think about anything. He's very rash. He's very thoughtless. He makes all of these mistakes. So is he a figure to be emulated or not? And you see both sides of this coming out in the way that the ancients interacted with him. So, for example, the Neo-Assyrian kings, they're talking about 7th century BC in northern Iraq, they love to compare themselves to Gilgamesh. It's like they haven't really got the message about them needing to listen to their advisors. They just celebrate the Gilgamesh who goes on quests and adventures and kills monsters and things like that. So both of these sides exist.
So I've given my fair share of Gilgamesh presentations, and the number one question that I always get asked, the most popular question, is one that you actually know a lot more about than me. So I'm very happy to be asking the question rather than receiving it for once. And that is, was Gilgamesh performed? And if so, how was it performed? What do we know about the oral nature of the epic, the oral presentation of the epic?
Well, I think it was performed because if you look at the internal structure of it, you have all of these sequences of repetitions. Which when you read it on a page, it maybe leaves us a bit cold, like, oh, why am I reading this again? Let's skip it and turn the page. But when you hear it out loud, it has a completely different effect. When you hear something repeated, this is actually reinforcing things. Reinforcing things you've heard before, helps you remember it. And especially when it's set to music, kind of repetition of music is something that is not boring, but it's something that's actually intimate. People enjoy. So I think primarily from that, if you imagine Gilgamesh as song, at that point it takes a clear. And that's something we have to think how it was formed, fortunately. But the clues are there. The clues are there.
Do you think there was music to it? This, I know this, I guess, because
But we also have to make clear that these repetitions are not the same as the kind of repetitions we find in America. The kind of formulaic repetition that there in Homer leads us to conclude that there was an oral background, that it started out as oral poetry, that later became written down. And that's not what we're saying about Gilgamesh now, because as we can tell, it was written from the very beginning. But we're wondering whether it was performed rather than it originally performed. Which is a slightly different thing, where some repetitions are good in music, some repetitions are good to memorize it, and it's a musical kind of Because, you know, this is something you said, like, you don't want anything in the same thing, and you get a cost. It's quite different from riddles.
And sometimes the scribes, if they come across a passage that's repeated, they'll just use a cuneiform sign that means the same thing again. So it's, you know, even for them in writing, it's a bit, they don't want to spell it out again. So perhaps we can jump a little back and forth, but I also want to hear about your encounter with Gilgamesh. How did you come to it? What has it meant for you? Perhaps to us as an academic, and then we'll touch on your plays.
Yeah, so Gilgamesh, it was my gateway to ancient Mesopotamia, really. I came across it completely by chance. I was browsing in a bookshop and there was one of his new versions had come out, and I picked it up and thought, oh, this is kind of interesting, I'll probably like this. And I read it in one sitting and I was absolutely hooked. So yeah, it's been hugely significant, literally changed my life. I now teach Gilgamesh for a living. So it's been hugely significant to me. And precisely because, as we said, it's so vast ranging, Gilgamesh, and it contains so much of Mesopotamian culture within it. It's a great introduction to that whole world, to that whole society, to the ways that they think, the unusual ways they think. And also, you know, when you were mentioning the speech that Gladstone made comparing to Homer, I had exactly the same reaction. My precocious teenage self pulled out my diary and started writing about comparisons with Homer, because that was what I knew, right? There's so much in it that's familiar.
You must find those diaries.
I wish I'd not mentioned that on camera. I forgot we were being recorded. But it has so much in common with the classical world that we may have encountered before. But there's so much in it that is so strange and so different. And for me, it's that ideal combination of things that you are just enough familiar with to start to understand, but so much mystery in it that it makes you really want to know more. So that was the real hook for me.
Yeah. Do you feel like your understanding of Gilgamesh has changed over time as you have reread it many times? So I guess you delve into it. Like, do you feel like some themes come to the foreground, others become less important over time?
Yes, definitely. It changes every time I read it. I find something new in it. It's one of those powerful silences, right? And start to speak even more loudly. I think you notice new things in it every time because it's so multi-layered. It's so vast, there's so much in it. One thing I noticed last time I was reading in Babylonian, just little things, like it's such a modern poem in some ways. So when they are describing the reappearance of the mountains after the flood, they're describing the mountain peaks appearing as being like ziggurats, like temples. And it just made me see how they're so focused on the world of the city that they're describing even nature as like their own built environment. And we do the same thing, you know, with our technology. I think nature is in a screen these days, and they were doing exactly the same thing.
The question about whether it's changed if you can sell anecdotes. So there was a conference where being giving a presentation and I couldn't be there physically. So I gave a paper for her and I read it out loud. And then the chair of that panel was Andrew George, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. But he is the editor of Gilgamesh, this truly fantastic text edition on which my translation and many other studies of Gilgamesh rely, is really like laid the foundation for Gilgamesh studies in a truly amazing way. And so he announced that because Selena wasn't there in presence, it wouldn't be fair to be asking questions of this paper. And so we had 10 minutes to fill in the conference program. And then Andrew ad-libbed and began his ad-libbing about Gilgamesh with the words that will forever remain in my mind, which were, I find myself very much agreeing with the outlook of the epic, but I find myself agreeing with different parts of the epic as I grow older. And he said, it has turned from a tale of youthful impudence to old age impotence, which, you know, you really have to be a professor in order to pull that off. But yes, Andrew is here in spirit, I'm sure. So that was perhaps about your academic encounter with the text. What about you? You're also a playwright and a poet yourself. How has it influenced you artistically?
Well, as a writer, I think one of the things that stands out to me is how it's such a perfect story in that it contains everything that you would want from a story almost. And it strikes me how similar it is to what we expect from all stories now. in our modern culture. It's one of the first works to follow the so-called hero's journey that was identified by Joseph Campbell, where somebody has to go on a quest. He faces obstacles that lead him to a place of deep character change, and learns something about himself on the way at the end. And this is really fundamental to most mainstream stories now. I mean, Hollywood writers will follow this. Like screenwriting gurus, this basic structure, and you see it in Gilgamesh for the first time. So that's another way, which is has influenced me. I definitely have drawn on it in my plays when I'm thinking about what words do I put in the mouths of my characters, how do they see the world, and I draw on Babylonian literature for that included, whether it's as metaphors in terms of phrase, just the way that they're thinking.
Are there other specific adaptations, translations, versions that have inspired you, like not beyond the Babylonian text, like specific modern takes on Gilgamesh that have meant something particular to you? You remember which translation you read?
It was Stephen Mitchell.
Stephen Mitchell, right.
Which, when you admit that to a Syriologist now, they all, I want to hide, I'm sorry. But actually, I think it does do a very good job for people who've never encountered the text themselves. It has a kind of rawness to it and an immediacy, which makes it very easy to engage with, I think. So I think it does do a good job.
Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about the encounter with the Babylonian text as literature. We've talked about some of these larger, thematic, the many themes that are in the epic, these overall narrative structures, what you can get out of it, but simply as literature, as verse line by line. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about, questions of meter, perhaps, or questions of how is it structured as poetry, if that question makes sense, in the original?
How's it structured? Well,
what is the experience of reading it in Babylonian to you?
Well, I suppose this is one aspect where the performative nature of it really comes alive, because it does have a very, very strong rhythm. And it does delight in assonance and consonants and wordplay and all of those things. So yeah, and it's very, very compact. That's the other thing as well. I mean, Babylonian poetry is mostly made up of 4 words to a line.
Yeah.
Which
is extremely compact.
Yeah, and when you read that in an English translation, you can't quite get the sense of that dense rhythm of it, and just how it becomes quite hypnotic as well. And you get these regular lines with 4 beats, and then you get the ones with 3 beats as well. So where there's suddenly introducing a pause or something, or speeds up or something suddenly comes up short. So they can play with the pacing and the delivery as well in quite a striking way.
I'm not sure how I would answer this question, but I'm curious about your answer. Do you feel like it's a difficult text in Babylonian? Do you feel it's complicated to read? How do your students respond to it? Do they find it easy to read? Or do they find it?
It's kind of medium.
Yeah. I mean, Babylonian poetry, they really want it once, they push the envelope. Extremely difficult one with that.
No, it's not actually. I mean, it's not easy by any means, but we normally read it the second year, I think. Yeah, so you do need a pretty decent grounding to get on with it. But yeah, it's one of the more accessible ones.
Yeah, it's not that hard. But I totally agree with this sense of compactness. It's an enormously dense text, and every line seems very happy, very thought out. It's not haphazard. But also the metaphors in Gilgamesh are absolutely fantastic. Those ziggurat you just mentioned are a great example of when it uses quite surprising metaphors at the time. I mentioned earlier the storm of his heart, which I think is a wonderful metaphor for restlessness. And there are many like that. Any closing thoughts on Gilgamesh and what it has meant to you?
Oh, closing thoughts. Well, I think we could easily be here for hours, so we can't leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Selena.
Many question. Many question.
No, you won't be quizzed on your knowledge of Mesopotamian culture, not to worry. But first of all, if you could just introduce your work as engaged with Gilgamesh.
Yeah, I mean, you know that I'm a visual artist. Who lived in here for a while, and I come to more into in-depth things with Gilgamesh in 110 around that time. I had very interested to do it before my heritage, culture, history, and so on. And I was interested in that aspect of history, that cycles and the kinds of things. And I thought Gilgamesh, the artist offered me a lot of ideas, as Selena was talking, you were talking about. And for me, was very interested much in the transformative nature of the epic, as Gilgamesh goes through so many phases of many events or phases, as all of us almost go through, in sometime in our lives. So I thought this writing passage that Gilgamesh goes through, as you were discovering before, from being 2/3 good and 1/3 human, then go and meet Kido is from ordinary people, and so this break the hierarchy, and then go on the story on and on, then curiosity and question about friendship and challenge and rebelliousness, and as well confronting the guardian of the forest, and so on. Then seeing Kido dying in front of his eye, he starts fear the death, and so on. Then another journey to mountain tunnels, valleys, and to where he wants to seek cure for life, for eternity. And then, of course, he come empty-handed and back where he started. So my drawing is somehow encapsulate in a very contemporary way. It's not like very narrative, it's not realistic as such, but try to encapsulate the sense of this idea of this kind of starting point where he came from Morocco and go through all this event, and then continues organically as his curiosity, as his restlessness push him to do more and see more and seek more and challenge more. But then in the end, he come back to where he started really. So this, I want to, somehow reflect that element, this essence in my work. So it's the whole series more about that really, of kind of the beginning, and then going to the top or to the wherever, and came back somehow humiliated, but as well enlightened, and to start again from where he started in Oregon, to accept the reality like he, as human, like everybody else, and have to face the same reality of death like everybody else. So yeah, that's for me what I know. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. So I understand that for you, the epic is. It consists of a series of transformations, but a series of transformations that are ultimately cyclical and ultimately came compared back to the one which he came. But Walid has very kindly agreed to share some of his work. Yes, United States.
We are the same, we shouldn't look for any specific event, but somehow it does depend of some ideas or some images or pictures in the story that somehow, it emulates not in that area.
Thank you very much for sharing that. It's really, it's very moving. It's something can ask me more.
Yes, I will, absolutely. So I think one of the things that I really find powerful about this series, the Rites of Passage series, is, as you've already talked about in your introduction, like how it combines the sense of continuity, because many of these is one long winding line, with a sense of constant change and then circularity.
Definitely, something very much in the end. Gilgamesh is always moving, right?
Definitely both the same and a different character at the same time.
Yeah, and Selena said that as she described, almost described my work, that there's no obvious ending to the poems. So as things are evolving all the time, changing and moving forward, and the flow is continuous. Yes, it's in the story. I wasn't thinking like, but it became like that. But
Because of the walls, the ends of the walls, at the same time, And then another thing that I find very interesting in thinking about the epic through the lens of your work is, again, to pick up something Selena said, that there's a lot of repetition in this artwork, but the repetition feels so dynamic. It doesn't feel static. It feels like, and again, like that's the case with the epic. These repetitions, they feel powerful rather than.
Because I think the variation on this event, which in the end all feed into each other for the story continue, for the as well for idea of the concept of the story, that this kind of curiosity to encounters and challenges and defeat and humiliation back. So all the time, each stage, the repetition is there, but in a different format, because maybe the story a bit different, the background different, the space different, the time. And as you see, daylight, birth, sadness, sorrows, challenges, rebelliousness. So each time is different, And as well about repetition, I just want to add as well, and I think maybe my friend here, more, the repetition is still, I think, continue in Iraq as well. In the language, even other people, when they tell you something, they repeat it again. Sometimes they tell you the same thing twice or three times. And it seems that something is just been going on from that time.
You mean the storytellers now?
And even the story, even when they tell you something after they've witnessed it, when they went to the market to see an accident, they repeat again the same story twice, maybe.
That's very interesting. But it's also like the thing you were talking about with this continuity and change. It actually also reminded me of another story that came up in Selena's conversation now, which was the other poem that Gilgamesh draws on, the story of the flood at Lahasis, because that is also such a story of where every new change leads to something else and its opposite. That begins with the creation of the world. And then it begins with some gods being made to do that creation. And those gods get angry, and they revolt. And that problem is solved through the creation of humanity, because then they take on the burden of work. But that becomes a new problem, because then there are too many humans, and then that has to be solved. And like this whole complete sequence of like shifts gradually giving way to each other. So maybe that is part of what the Babylonian literary tradition expresses.
Yes, and I think as you as well hinted at as well, that how the Gilgamesh is so synonymous with the whole Mesopotamian culture. That's why you see it's adapted not only by Iraqi or South Iraq or something even beyond, like in Syria or Anadolu in Turkey. And of course, another nation. So it's really it's like a very clear piece of literature that represents the whole culture as a whole, really, and the philosophy and the religion part as well, which we know, like how this story there that are much older than Bible and Quran and so on.
That leads perfectly to my next question, which is, as a Western academic, I would love to know more about what is the place of Gilgamesh in the Iraqi culture. Like, how is this celebrated? Is this taught in schools? Those.
I mean, there is, but not. I mean, I have some friends, maybe they're more than me here in the audience. But I think, like me as a student, I wasn't taught a lot about that, because Iraq was so much involved into so many conflicts and wars. So they were more interested in other aspects of more reason or Islamic or kind of to fight against the colonialism and so on. So there was not much emphasis on the history. There was some, of course, we have an Iraqi museum, but me, 5 years in as a student of art, like that, as a young person, I think once or twice we were taken to the museum. So there was not much really of that there. And unfortunately, Iraq so booked into these wars and violence that there was no much, space or time or whatever or focus, even for the academy or for the pedagogue to take us there to so much available as well. They are surrounded. We'll take it too many. So, but I think the literary people, the artists, the playwrights, of course, visual artists, they're all at some time, at some stage of their life, they've been engaged in the story. But as a general public, I don't think it's much really.
Right. Yeah. I know that the first Arabic translation of Gilgamesh by Talbakir, that was illustrated by Diyad Sawi, which I think is a very good example of Diyad Sawi, this great Iraqi modernist. Great example of the link in Iraq between the visual arts and the story of Gilgamesh. As far as I know, there is not a Kurdish Gilgamesh translation yet. Yes.
As far as I know.
But so you must have read it then in Arabic?
Arabic and English, yes.
What was the Arabic translation like, if I may ask?
It was such a long time.
But that's fair enough. But it is also, Gilgamesh is also. Well, thanks for you. Sorry.
Sorry,
Writer as well translated the Gilgamesh. Yeah, it's more poetic than Taha. I think it's my.
But Gilgamesh is also meant to be viewed not just as the Iraqi, but also as the next. Because Gilgamesh is also a story of travel.
There's something as I was saying before, I think Gilgamesh is for everybody. And I think, of course, we are Iraqi or from the region, more affiliated with the different part of culture. Of course, what's going on there, that the always spoke to be on some other thing, hopefully, that while we, the intellectual or artists or writer, we all want to shift focus onto our heritage and those great ideas, which brought to us, but from the center of humanity. Yes, don't talk about and actually be inspired by it and actually use them, use the story and writing. So it brought everybody there.
Yeah, but I'm also just wondering, because of the themes that you're working with, are themes like nostalgia or being away from the place. Gilgamesh he's a traveler at the end of the day. He spends very little time in the epic in his actual home city. He's always somewhere else.
I mean, as I said before, it was like everybody's story in a way. You see yourself, some aspect of the story in you and your journey. And for me as well, being quite 68-ish, I've been through so much from a very small town in north of Iraq to Baghdad and studying in Yugoslavia, came here and years. Now I'm sort of more leaning towards focusing back again. So it is like my journey going back again. I'm doing more project there, more focusing there. And of course, then a few years ago when I started this as well, that was part of the beginning of me getting more engaged, more in the
So again,
so this that element, of course. I don't know if it's a nostalgia, but maybe it's kind of, I don't know, it's affinities. As I was saying, we want to focus more into our own creative heritage, really, that we have that not been highlighted or been focused on or been, explored. Away from the violence and, which as well, some aspect of it have a lesson or some affinity with what we seen, like you were talking before about my video film, which I made some parallel idea between Saddam and Gilgamesh. I used Gilgamesh text in the video. So
tell us just a little bit about the work, because I just love that work of yours so much. But you can tell us the background of that Saddam work is.
In the late 80s, was Saddam the height of his power. He went into this crazy campaign of building so many palaces on top of every mountain, and as well all over Iraq actually. But in my area, in the Hawk, where I come from, he built 40 palaces, and one of them in the top of the highest mountain ever in the area. It's very high. And of course, there was no road before, just go by mule or something, but he created a road for it, everything. So just about he finished, and the war started with Iran, and of course he couldn't have no money anymore, and he was kind of bogged down just in Baghdad, and he lost the control of the Kurdish area. So people come and most they grabbed all the metal bricks and everything, but that palace was too high, so they couldn't. But still, they took some, but they didn't finish it up. So later it comes, that they erected some telecommunication towers on it, and there was few guards, and some animal lovers had 3 bears or two birds. They have a ceremoniously to breed the bear in Hannibal, where Saddam used to have the palace. In April or March, actually. Still a bit slow. But this is natural habitat for the bear, because there's a lot of cases like that. And they've released them, but they're not used to living in such environment, because there's, the condition not as used to be like 100 years ago. Right. There was all mines around. You see the mine signs, and this, the nature have changed really. So these poor, they don't know what to do, and they as well become enemy of the beekeepers. I think one of them killed, the other one came to be a refuge at the palace, and the guard was giving him food, but he became very stressed there. So they was kind of with the barrier, but this fed all that. So I came that time when I saw that happen, and I used the footage from when he was released ceremoniously by this Kurdish woman fighter, and a man as well. And then what happened to the fate of the bear? So I did make a kind of a parallel between the fate of Iraqi as a whole, not just during and before Saddam as well. And so I related the story of extract from the Gilgamesh story. Yeah, and I inserted it on the images. Yeah, with the drone. So yeah. No, yeah, because that's how these two things. The cycle continues somehow. This kind of current of things continues in Iraq. One go, another one come, but the idea not changed. It's the same, yeah. Yeah, there's so many odd parallels to Gilgamesh with the story. Like also the human-animal relation, which is so central to Gilgamesh. Animals are everywhere in Gilgamesh. And like I was thinking of Humbaba. He has this weird anti-kingdom in the forest of cedars that is like Gilgamesh's kingdom in Uruk, but totally different. And I was thinking of these bears in their palace, but also like Selena was talking about, in the ancient world, Gilgamesh is used to talk about how kings are dangerous and kings need to be reined in. It's kind of like an anti-royal story, but the kings themselves don't see that at all. They're like, oh, I'm big and powerful like Gilgamesh. And it's the same with Saddam also loves to compare himself to Gilgamesh, but you can also use it as an anti-Saddam story. And I think that it just weaves beautifully into so much of the Gilgamesh reception. Thank you for telling me. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. So, moving to Delhi. So I would love to hear an extract from your Gilgamesh Retold, but perhaps you could just begin by telling us what this book is and how you came to write it, and then give us the taste of it afterwards.
I was researching my father. My father fought in the Mesopotamian campaign in the First World War. He was quite old. He was in his 50s when I was born. So people say, gosh, you must be really old. Your father fought in the First World War. But actually he did survive it because he was shot in the leg while he was supervising the digging of trenches, which probably saved his life because, as everyone knows, the Mesopotamian campaign was one of the most horrific campaigns in the First World War. So I started researching Mesopotamia, Iraq, and of course, before very long, I stumbled across the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it was like I'd written an essay for Arcanet might have published this book. And I compare it, the impact to, if any of you, I'm sure most of you will know Wordsworth. I'm sure a lot of you will have read his Prelude. And there's a wonderful instance when he's a small child. He talks about spots of time that it could make a huge influence on your mind and you know, life-changing and mind-changing. And he tells this story about getting up at night on a summer's evening, and he steals out of the house. It's the midsummer, and he goes down to the lake and he steals a boat. And he's very proud because he's learned to row. And he rows to the centre of the lake. And the moon is so bright, it causes the mountains. It's in the Lake District in Cumbria, in the UK. It causes the shadows to be cast by the mountains. And it's as though the mountains are striding over the lake after him. And that, to me, is the effect that the Epic of Gilgamesh had on me, Andrew George's version.
Right.
And I was just completely taken over by it. I worked with the youth theatre, Pegasus Youth Theatre in Oxford. And I wrote a play called After Gilgamesh with the young people, and they created quite a lot of the scenarios. A lot of the things you've been talking about, the mysteriousness and strangeness and the unexplained parts, you know, the loose ends that aren't ever tied up, really. So it leaves it very much open for everyone to have their own ideas. And the young people really related to it very well. So that's how I came across Gilgamesh, I think we should say. And as it's been said, I can't decipher cuneiform. Although I was given a Hawthornden fellowship to go to a castle near Edinburgh to try and decipher cuneiform for a month. And I had talked to Irving Finkel at the British Museum quite a lot. And he is anyone who knows him knows he's very enthusiastic. And he's very much for everyone needs Gilgamesh in their life. So go and try and do your best. And I think the castle was haunted. I think that's my excuse. And the ghosts got in the way because I just found in a month, I translated about 20 lines. And then I thought, A, I'm not going to live long enough to translate it all, but also B, what difference can I make trying to make a scholarly translation? What's the point of it?
Yeah.
You know, I can, where Andrew George uses thunder, I could use a metaphor, you know, a rumbling, but what's the point of that? And then you were talking about the operas and the artwork, and also my friend Monica has done wonderful art based on Gilgamesh. And again, ballet, there was a wonderful ballet in Paris. I think his name was Alexander Danilovsky. Does that ring any bells? And he wrote a ballet, and it was for orchestra and wolves' voices. And to me, that is, please somebody put my book on with an orchestra and wolves' voices, because that is what Gilgamesh is. It's going into a forest and hearing wolves, and that atavistic connection to our deepest roots, I think, is why people connect so strongly to Gilgamesh.
There's also a chorus of monkeys. But yeah, so one could really
get to town, yes.
Yeah.
The bright spotted roller bird is apparently a hoopoo, Andrew George says.
Yeah, there is.
And he's cries from the tree, my wing, my wing, my wing. I did actually look up cuckoos to try and hear what they really sounded like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's endless
inspirations on every page. Yeah.
They're probably here. I have
Yeah,
to say,
yeah.
I also lived in a former haunted castle. So we do.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
But not
The blues book, I did my exchange stay with the blues book university, where astrology is taught in a castle. And since what we were studying there were ghosts, because the professor there, Damian Schremer, specializes in exorcism of, among other things, ghosts, which is ghosts were very much on my mind as I was sitting in this house and doing my very best to recycle the cuneiform. With mixed success, I think.
I think you obviously have friendly ghosts.
Or Danny was successful in exercising them. One of them's the one.
I'd rather disapproving Scottish ghosts.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So, very briefly, I won't read a great deal because I think there's been so much wonderful information and discussion to take in. But I just want to talk a little bit about the actual poetry because I had to decide, was I going to choose a form? And the obvious form, especially as has been Selena and Sophus have said, is this discussion about, is it performative? And it obviously was. I think Andrew George thinks it was performed at Temple, you know, on the steps of the temple. So the obvious choice in the English language poetry is blank verse, because that's what Shakespeare used. And it's very good for telling stories because you don't have to rhyme, but you keep up this iambic with a 5-beat line. And then Andrew George says in his book that Babylonian poetry has some resonance with Anglo-Saxon poetry. I don't know if you agree, Selena.
She would. She would.
I don't know about the alliteration, although there is quite a lot of alliteration, isn't there? But there's sort of beats, 2 strong beats. It's not as rigid as Anglo-Saxon, which is 2 alliterative beats before and after a caesura. But so that was another option.
Yeah.
And then it took 7 years to write.
Wow.
So as I was going along, I was also thinking of Dante, which that's Serena, of course, is a great storyteller. It's a great storytelling form, but it's incredibly because it's very tempting to, you find a rhyme or a half rhyme, and it's very tempting to then go off on another bit, on a digression that allows you to use the rhymes. You have to be very strict with yourself. And also I was very interested in medieval poetry and the idea of mirroring, which you've talked about, both of you. And so what I wanted was a sort of chiastic or a mirroring structure, so that there was sort of chapters of terza rima, chapters of ottava rima, chapters of blank verse. So, and I wanted the actual central lines of the whole book to be you're only 2/3 God.
Yes.
Because that's what it all boils down to.
Yeah.
Is his humanity.
Yeah.
And it's that little 1/3 of being human that causes him all his problems. I mean, if he was a whole completely God, of course he could, you know, he could have knocked Inanna off her perch.
Right.
So, but that was probably taking it a bit far and being a bit. But anyway, so I'll just read a little bit.
You want that?
I'll read, and also, yes, some people are very annoyed that I've taken liberties with the story, and I've introduced things and I've left a lot out, but it's just my version of the story.
Yeah.
And if it could have wolves howling while everyone reads it, that would be ideal.
We will have to supply the mental illness ourselves.
Please. See. It has been performed actually, extracts, and it's amazing what physicality of actors brings a whole new dimension into it. Just going to read you the part where Gilgamesh and Enkidu have killed the giant Humbaba in the Siti forest. And they come back, and Gilgamesh bathes and puts on his royal robes and his gold crown, and he comes out onto the balcony, and Inanna, the goddess of war and sex, and I always think that sort of, imagine all the other minor goddesses of rain and seeds. I'm the goddess of war and sex. And so she takes the fancy to in a big way. So just took one look, it stopped her breath, as if the fire ran under her skin, as if knocked down by an iron bell. Inanna saw Gilgamesh and fell. Goddess of war, thunderbolt thrower, she shook with desire like a reed in the reed bed. Her lungs lost their power, her voice became lower. She opened to Gilgamesh like a small flower. Come, love, into my sweet-smelling chamber, in a golden chariot studded with amber, drawn by a team of lions and mules, with bridles of silver and boats of black. As you cross my threshold, my door with the rest of it, you'll conquer my court and conquer my. Our rain will bring bounty, be fertile and fecund. Each goat shall have triplets, each ewe shall have twins. Our donkeys and horses shall outrace the wind. Our oxen each day shall flower in flower. Our orchards and farmland shall give a full harvest. Our seas with a rich crop of silver with breath. Only come to me with honor, which will be wet, lie close. The Gilgamesh turns to look at man, looked through his lashes, holy and man. Then he said, "You? Who would marry you? You're a dog in the road, crawling with fleas. You're a blade of frost, scraping the ice. A broken door that lets the wind through. A cup that cuts the lip of the drinker. A shoe that bites the foot of its owner. You're a palace that maims its own heroes. A fireplace that puts out its own fire. A fortress that slaughters its own soldiers, an elephant that kills its own mahout." Inanna's eyes grew cold as slate, her growl of rage a thunderous belch. The veins of her neck stood out like vines. She spat words like a hail of spears. You're only 2/3 God. I'll strike the part of you that's human. Your tears will stream like a river in spate. I'll send a storm to crush your heart. And then she goes up and up to her father's, to Anu, her father in heaven. And she asks him for the heavenly sky bull to bring down to earth to destroy Gilgamesh and take revenge on this 2/3 God who's actually rejected her. So she, Anu says, no, that's not on at all. You can't take this stuff. Sorry. So Inanna says, "I'll open up the gates of hell. I'll wake the dead. I'll set them free to eat the living. There'll be no soul left on earth." So Anu says, "Okay, all right, take the bull." So Inanna called the heavenly bull. Her words flew like a flock of birds. She called again, and it was night, and at her call he came to her. Inanna led him down from heaven, where he grazed among the planets. Round his flanks light danced and spun, and he was made of stars and burning. His eyes were meteors, big as moons, his tail a trail of flaming comets, each tuft of hair a galaxy, each breath a moving constellation. When the sky bull's hoof touched down, it smashed to dust the town of Gersu. When its second hoof touched down, it set 8 miles of fields ablaze. When the bull's third hoof touched down, it opened up a 9-mile crater. When the bull's fourth hoof touched down, 10,000 strong men toppled in. When he bowed his head to drink, in one great gulp he drained Euphrates. When he raised his tail to piss, Tigris rose and burst its banks. Thank you, Ben.
That was wonderful. So I'd like to ask about this line that you wanted to be the center of the epic. And I love that choice of the line. You're only 2/3 God and 1/3 human. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to use that one. So in the epic, this line used twice. And 30 years in the community prologue where the narrator is telling us about this fantastic Gilgamesh, oh, you're 2/3 God. And then when later he's trying to answer around the gods, there's these scorpion people who were debating whether to let him in.
Yes.
And the scorpion man says to the scorpion wife, he says, you know, here you come to the flesh of the gods, implying that he should go there. Scorpion woman replies, no. That's God, but human. And so the story does the same thing that you do here, that like emphasizing his humanity, right? Emphasizing first his divinity and then his humanity. And I think that's so interesting that you work with that and transpose it to the core of the epic.
Yeah.
But I think in both cases, in the epic and in your version of it, it is spoken by a woman in resistance to Gilgamesh, right? Like it is the scorpion woman in the epic, and here is Ishtar. And of course, that leads to the question of, what does the voice of the female character mean in your version?
Well, it was very important to not to make it a feminist version, but to feminize it in ways, bring out because apart from Inanna, all the female characters are benign. Minson, his mother, is very fitting. Can't see any flaws in it at all. Siduri helps him, the talent keeper, and even the scorpion woman, the female scorpion who helps tells him. So, and Shampoo helps him. I mean, he curses her and then revokes her.
We didn't really go with the Shampoo. Yes, also fascinating.
Yes, temple prostitutes. I called her Iraqi-born, which is a Greek name, word, or a sacred prostitute, which we have no concept of sacred prostitute. I think it's very hard in our culture to understand what it means. But I found that all the versions I read in English, including Stephen Mitchell's, that the seduction of Enkidu,
Which is what makes him human, right? They have sex,
which is what makes him 6 days and 7 nights.
And that turns into this animal thing. So
Yeah. But I found a lot of the translations of that episode, which were mostly by men, really coarse. And I mean, it's strange because I just found that they use words like then the wild man attacked her, and the wild man, you know, and it's all almost pornographic, you know. It's using the language of pornography, which I think is completely out of place in that episode, because as you say, it's about being humanized. I mean, it's odd to us. Also, she gives him bread and beer. You know, she encourages him to eat bread and drink beer, and be, you know, and physically connect with her. But it's not to reduce it to a sort of, you know, pornographic film almost. I felt very angry about it. And so I mean, my publisher, Michael Schmidt, thinks that I aestheticized that episode much too much. And he's... but I mean, I'm talking about the aestheticizing in the way that, say, Alexander Pope aestheticized the Iliad. You know, there's Homer's very robust and coarse often, as well as being wonderfully lyrical. But for example, there's an episode, description of flies buzzing around a milk pail. You know, the milk's obviously gone off and it's dirty, and the flies are swarming around it in Homer's version. And in Pope's version, the flies are sort of transformed into little jewel things flitting on a summer's evening in a bower of roses. And that's what Michael, my publisher, who I'm very fond of, accused me of doing, of aestheticizing unnecessarily this episode. But I think there's a spirituality in it, and I saw it as a sort of, you know, if it was a performance, almost as a liturgical, you know, could be a part of a liturgy of souls coming together. And he, you know, might say that's anachronistic, that souls aren't mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but actually I sent before I sent it to the publisher, my friend Adnan Al-Saik, who I work with and have translate his work, introduced me to a wonderful academic called Dr. Salah Niazi. I'm sure, Gary, you know him. And he's very, and I think he was head of Arab studies for the World Service, wasn't he? Or Arab programs for the World Service for about yes, for about 30 years, and knew a huge amount about Gilgamesh. And he, you know, we went through it, and I said, "Well, it comes from your." I don't know whereabouts in Iraq he comes from, but I said it comes from your country, your culture. And he was the person who actually used the word souls, and he said it may be anachronistic, but in a modern context, that's what I was trying to say, that they had some kind of communion that was more than just sexual.
Would you perhaps like to read that?
Oh, yes, yes.
The seduction scene to work on.
Yes. It was actually performed last week, and the seduction scene, the director and actors did it very well, because they did it sort of from a distance. But anyway, yeah, they did. You can tell me if you think it's too romantic. Okay, so the Shamhat has walked 3 days through the wilderness, and she's been told to lie down by the lake or waterhole, strip off, you know, lie naked by the lake. This was the other thing. you know, with a lot of the male and some of the female versions, the idea that any woman would actually trek 3 days into the wilderness, strip naked and lie by a lake as bait for a wild man, and actually, you know, be happy with that. No. Anyway, this was my version of it. Shamhat was sitting quiet by the pool's edge, watching the flickering fish in the shallows, when suddenly Enkidu stood there before her. She took in his odour of forest and hillside. The hierodule gasped as he bent to touch her, stroking her hair like the fur of an animal, stroking her thighs like the flank of an animal. As he caressed her, he thanked her softly. The Nana looked down, blessing her. 6 days, 7 nights, their bodies were joined. 6 days, 7 nights, their flesh was one flesh. 6 days, 7 nights, their souls were one soul. On day number 7, they rested together. Then Enkidu set off to rejoin his herd. But now gazelles ran, flung fearful glances, hoof beats soon distant, patter sound. So once he's had union with a woman, a human, like the animal of the bird. I can't remember quite that's another mysterious thing.
Yeah, I think interestingly, you also brought that up to me as one of the other things about it, and what exactly is the nature of it? Why do we get another point. Just before we go into questions, I just wanted to give that you mentioned Adnan.
Oh yes.
Actually, just talk a little bit that as well. But also, that aspect of food.
Well, yes, I mean, I think you were saying that you didn't learn about Gilgamesh in school. But Adnan can pretty well recite the epic of Gilgamesh by heart. If he was here, he would start and then we'd have to say no. But it is wonderful to hear it read. I met Adnan because I was for this book about my father, which is called Taking Mesopotamia, which comes from a quote by Lord Grey of Falodon after the war ended. He said, taking Mesopotamia, we've gained nothing. We gained nothing and lost nothing. It was a complete waste of hundreds of thousands of lives. And anyway, so I'd started writing Gilgamesh poems, and I was reading at a cafe called the Troubadour Cafe in Earl's Court. And I was reading about Enheduanna, Uruk, Gilgamesh, Humbaba. And I saw this person in the front row sort of going like this. And I was slightly distracted. And then after the reading, he came with his translator who he was working with at the time. And he said, oh, she's talking about my country and my culture and Gilgamesh. And I gave him a copy of my book. And he translated one of the poems into Arabic and put it on a tape because it was that long ago, it was 2000, and sent it to me, which was lovely. And then I was talking to the curator of the Ancient Near East Gallery at the Ashmolean Museum, who's called Dr. Paul Collins. And it was about March 2013, which was the anniversary of the invasion of Iraq by US and UK troops. And also what Paul Collins was most interested was in memory, was the destruction and looting of the Baghdad Museum, because he worked in that at the bank, that was part of his training. And so we organised, thought about them, and so we organised a reading in the ancient Near East in front of the Assyrian art. And we started the reading about, and it was this awful snowstorm in March. And Adnan's son family drove him, and it was literally through snow, with three white, and about 100 people crammed into this small gallery. And Adnan started with reciting the Epic of Gilgamesh in Arabic. And from there, we've gone on, we've then got arts council. We've done a lot of collaborations with artists. Suad al-Akhtar, I don't know, very famous artist. And illustrators, cartoonists, dancers, musicians. I've written a song which has had about 100,000 hits on YouTube, which is called Anthem for Gilgamesh. And it's just gone on, and we've done a huge amount of translation. We've been to universities, and we've travelled extensively. So that's how Gilgamesh brings people and cultures together, I think, and builds bridges, which is the most important thing.
That's great. Before I open up for questions, I don't like loose threads, so I wanna really pick up on the Anglo-Saxon again.
No.
Sort of like mentioned that and then moved on.
Oh, right, yes.
So,
Well, I was talking about the Anglo-Saxon, prosody and the Rites, really, but also there are themes, the themes of exile, the seafarer, the wanderer, the wonderful poems, and the idea that the noble man, you go into exile across the whale, which is the sea, the Pennant. The noble man finds his sorrow, his death. It's a marvelous, and that's where poetry and music and art come from.
yeah, there's also the new word, the Anglo-Saxon. And the Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I analysed one Babylonian poetry according to the principles of Anglo-Saxon. So Babylonian meter is a great mystery, right? Because it doesn't follow any set pattern. Can't really say you have X number of syllables here, X number of syllables there, like the kind of poetry that we are often used to. But Anglo-Saxon poetry is very similar to Babylonian in that it doesn't matter how many unstressed syllables you have, it only matters how many stressed ones you have. And what matters is where those stressed ones are in relation to the unstressed, basically. So I used this kind of same approach that was used to classify these different types of verse in Anglo-Saxon poetry or Babylonian poetry, and I found that you can actually say, okay, this is one type of verse, this is another, and then you can actually start to analyze it in a similar way. And they even write it in a similar way in the manuscript. So in Babylonian poetry, they usually write in two columns. The focus is already which means mark with a space. And in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, they mark that with a dot usually to show that actually this is two halves of the same line. So that was really what inspired me to get started on that. Yeah.
Your reading might be very much like the air style, the wanderer and the seafarer, very much with them, so very.
Yeah, I think they were in my head. But other parts, I won't read anymore, but other parts of blank verse don't, or just sort of like scripts or polyphonic, this idea of sounds coming. It's quite hard to put it on a page.
So I just want to ask a very question. I just want to ask to leave the damage. It's for the Iraqi or modern Arabic translator, or not for the Western. Like, for example, I think there is a unity between
for this and Gilgamesh in some way, you know. Yeah. And there's very much like in modern Arabic culture, especially in art. We take an art, cinema, music, poetry, narrative. Even people, they call them, for example, my friend and his son in Cuba. Sitori as well. Ishtar is very popular name. Yeah. So it's everywhere. Then I wrote about Gilgamesh, bilingual Arabic English, and it's my personal response to that. Yeah, it's a different. I use the symbols like death, eternity, for example, exile, friendship, loss. Yeah.
So for those of you who
we study in school, we studied in school.
Yeah.
In middle school, we study history of Iraq. Yeah, and we study the ancient Iraq.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, it's a marvelous book. It's called Gilgamesh Snake, and I'm very happy that you brought it. Thank you. So perhaps actually you could tell us a bit, like since we're so fortunate to have another Gilgamesh, tell a little about this book. Like how did you come to write it? Like what was your process with this poem?
It's like I think we tried to use something. Some symbols of the religion, like for the word Iraqi, by British Council, for Iraqi also, for Iraqi, for British poets, and he, and so we work together with translate, and I went to the lecture with Johnny Glendy. I already wrote a poem called the Gilgamesh Snake, and the snake and the symbol. Yeah. But it's completely different. My Gilgamesh, my hero, is any modern Iraqi.
Yeah.
So we suffer wall and dictatorship. Yeah. And we translated all the poem, and I had some poems, and I removed it.
It was also a video installation.
And the video also, video by Roxanne as well about the poem.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, that video. Is it still online?
Yeah,
Available?
Yeah.
It's called Gilgamesh's Snake.
Yeah.
Really worth looking at that.
There's also a snake on your.
It's also,
I think it's a symbol for Helle.
Yeah.
Like when they use it in the pharmacy.
Yeah.
rejuvenation.
Because snake is called the grass of eternity.
Yeah.
That's why they use it as
the plant of youth. It steals the plant of youth, and
Yeah.
Gilgamesh loses youth, but the snake gains it. It's a very ambivalent figure in the epic. It's a very hopeful figure, but also a very depressing one. You know, like at the same time. It's very interesting.
Can I just ask you, when you translate something from a living language, you're stuck, you always bring up a native speaker and ask them. But as we all know, languages like this you can't, where there are particular points that puzzle. And for me, for instance, the only Semitic language where I had any knowledge of was Arabic, where I can sometimes find vocabulary quite difficult. Words have like huge number of different meanings. Were there difficult points for you? Do you want to?
Many. I mean, I call Selena among other people when I'm stuck.
Discussion about the translation.
Weevil, yeah, animals tend to be terrible to translate. But anyway, part of it, I translated Gilgamesh into Danish first, and then into English afterwards. And Danish I did it with my father, was a poet, but not an Assyriologist. But I think like those conversations helped me very much, and like also to get unstuck in some of the passages that I would get stuck in, and just sometimes it is a question of before you have to make a choice. Like choice. But there are many moments in the epic where the epic and the difficulty is a number of against 80%. Standard translational difficulty is, for example, in the sense that word is just so compact in the original, you have to choose one aspect of it rather than the other. Like as every translator does. And then there are moments of this language is dead, as you say. There is, for example, in Gilgamesh a few of what's called a hapak legomenon. And those are words that appear in Gilgamesh and absolutely nowhere else. And so like the one I'm thinking of, for example, Gilgamesh, if you do go to the smithy or the forge, the word for go And I just said now, like, it doesn't appear anywhere else. So are they hurrying there? Are they, sauntering there? Are they biking there? Who knows? Probably not bikes. So that's right. But then there are also those particular challenges that come from the material condition of the epic, like this preserved in clay tablets. And clay tablets are wonderful because they're so, long-lasting, but they also break. And so there are passages that you have to restore, you have to guess what's missing, or simply where different versions of the text have different, the same text in different ways. There are all sorts of challenges, sticking points as well. But that's, you work through that text base, line by line.
Thanks. That's the weevil I'm looking at.
Well, I'll tell you. The problem is that after Ishtar proposes to Gilgamesh, as we've heard, he rejects her. He rejects her by listing her ex-lovers, all of whom she had treated terribly, in order to illustrate why he was. And each of these lovers, Ishtar destroys after she has loved them. And the last of the stories that Gilgamesh tells is the story of Ishulan or the garden. And the garden actually rejects rejects Ishtar as well, and she then turns him into something. And since their conversation has this series of puns on eating, I think that she turns him into a garden pest. So like she turns him against his previous profession, something that eats his plants. And the word has a pun on the word small, so I thought a weevil. That's how I arrived at it. Some kind of garden.
Excellent, thank you. That's great. I really enjoyed it.
Turned him into a toad.
A toad.
I did have that problem. I didn't know what does he turn you into?
Yeah. But there, again, those are also the mysteries of the text.
Weevil.
There are so many dreams in Gilgamesh, which I find amazing. Unfortunately, many of them, when he goes to the mountain, they are very fragmented. But then before Enkidu arrives, he dreams of an axe and a meteor falling from the sky. I mean, I find it amazing. And then his mother interprets the dreams. And in the other case, Enkidu interprets the dreams. So I've never read so many dreams in an epic.
And one thing I found really difficult was the dreams when they're going to the mount to cross the mountain to the sea forest. They're all terrible.
Yeah, they are
Ominous dreams. There's one very beautiful line that says we were turned into snow and fell like ghosts, something like that. But there are horrific monsters that are tearing them apart, and then Enkidu says, "Fear not, all is well."
He always says it's a good omen.
It's a good omen. Somewhere in Samuel Kramer's, saying that it was just a custom that the opposite. You told when you're interpreting omens, you instead of saying, "Well, that's terrible, you're going to die," it was the opposite. You said, "Oh no, that's."
That's so much. I mean, maybe you.
Yeah, well, I think most of first of all, divination is so central to Babylonian culture. It's one of the reasons why so many dreams. Looking for the signs of what's to come is fundamentally part of what they are looking for to them. But the omens are overwhelmingly negative. If you look at any of these texts, they're all predicting disaster after disaster after disaster. They've got very impressive readings. But this is one of the ways that they cope with it, is they manage to spin the negatives into a positive somehow. Sometimes legitimately and sometimes in wishful thinking. I actually came across a letter to one of the Assyrian kings the other day where this scholar is writing to the king about various astrological omens he's observing, and he says something like, "Oh, concerning the rains that were really scanty this year, this is a good omen for the king, my lord. It means you're going to be successful in a military campaign. But hang on a minute. Harvest, like, how is this good? He finds a way to make it positive. So perhaps that's one of the reflections.
There's also one of the letters that says if a man is always ill, he will live a long life. He'll die young, which doesn't seem right. I don't think that's accurate, but there are many of these interesting omens.
Another thing that seemed sort of a bit strange was that, you know, to begin with, it's Enkidu who's saying, oh, from Baba, his breath is fire, his gaze is death. You know, we can't go to see the forest because he's been put there by the gods to protect the forest. And then at the end, when they're actually in the forest, and Gilgamesh is saying, let's go, let's go. It's Enkidu who says, no, where's your spine?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah, they reverse, and I think that's very interesting. And that at that moment in tablet 5, so usually the text marks the transition between speakers by saying, oh, and then so-and-so said. And there's this lovely Akkadian phrase for that, like Pashipush, which means like he made his mouth, which is like how it marks when somebody starts speaking. But in that passage, when they're talking to each other at the beginning of the entrance of the cedar forest, that isn't used. And because another wonderful thing about the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is that they never say each other's name. They only call each other my friend and my friend. And I thought that was such a sweet touch in the epic that they never actually speak each other's name. And because they don't, and because there's no lines marking the transition, it's quite hard to tell who is speaking to whom, because they've flipped around so many times. And it says then at the end of that passage, as one they walk into the forest, which really tells you that at that point they're sort of fused. And then disaster strikes, and the first word that Gilgamesh says after Enkidu dies is Enkidu, which is, heartbreaking. It's very, those moments of delicate composition. Yeah,
actually, that's an interesting point. You say in the text, it says, and then he says, or she says, and because Irving Finkel has the theory that proves that it was not written for performance, it was written to be narrated like Beowulf.
I disagree because it's such a lovely phrase in Akkadian. Like I can hear that being said in a performance.
Everyone has different theories, don't they? Which is great. Why not? Long live them. That.
Well, are there any final questions?
Yes. Quite interesting at the beginning when you mentioned and I can see the similarity. It made me think of Odysseus, the legendary king of Ithaca, when he confronted Wisnom, the one-eyed monster, which is really quite similar to Enkidu and the Gilgamesh, like Baba. Yeah. But at the same time, I would say similarity. I would not say plagiarism. But when you look at what we call modern days language religion, the story of Gilgamesh is exactly the story of Moses. What's involved clothing, and a gardener farmed him and eventually ended up working with the king as a chief gardener. The same thing, the story of the flood and the delusion, which is in the Old Testament and the Quran.
The other one is another example is where he goes to the other side of the world and he sees the sun setting in a pool of mud, which is in the Quran as well. What do you think the impact of if people become more aware of Gilgamesh on religion and modern Middle East? I mean, it just shows us it's really, first-hand plagiarism.
So this is a really interesting question, like both the relation between Gilgamesh and Homer and the relation between Gilgamesh and the Bible are some of the more like unsettled areas of Gilgamesh scholarship. For better and for worse, there's a lot of debate about both of those issues. So just to take them one by one, I think like with Gilgamesh and Homer, the question is, are these similarities, and there are a bunch of them, also like some of them are quite actually line by line specific, where you're like, okay, that has direct Mesopotamian parallels, and some of them are more abstract. But the question is, are these like general storytelling figures that were relayed, like Mesopotamian storytellers into Anatolia storytellers, into Greek storytellers, and so on and so forth, or is there a specific one-to-one connection? And I tend to think that there is not a smoking gun for a direct connection. I tend to think that it's like a series of connections. But it is different with the Bible. Like with the Bible, you can, and like the Old Testament, and in turn how that influenced Christianity and how that influenced the Quran and so on and so forth. There you can really see that they're responding to specific passages on the Babylonian narrative. Also in the creation story in Genesis, that's not responding to Gilgamesh, that's responding to another Babylonian epic. But there are a whole number of scenes in the Bible that are, like the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible was in large part composed in the city of Babylon during the Babylonian captivity, or in the immediate aftermath of that event. So there is there are many ways in which the Hebrew Bible can be read as an anti-Babylonian story that takes Babylonian myths and figures, but then recast them to tell a different story. And then that in turn has had consequences on, Quran and other religious texts that have engaged with the Hebrew Bible in turn. What was the specific example you mentioned? Oh yeah, the story of Moses. That's not so much responding to Gilgamesh as it is responding to a story about another Babylonian story, the story of King Sargon, who is also exactly like Moses, placed in a reed basket and then shipped down the river. So absolutely, I tend to think of the relation between the Hebrew Bible and Gilgamesh as closer to each other than the relation between Gilgamesh and Homer, but some of my colleagues would see that differently. So just to say that it's debated.
How story get repeated again and again. And what you see, for instance, in contrast between Mesopotamia and the ancient Egyptians, is that in Mesopotamia, the language, not only just the text, was also used to be simplified more and more, so to be more common among people, while in ancient Egyptians, the hieroglyphic was continuously kept refined to make it more complicated for the average man to understand. So it was really designed for the elites, in contrast with Mesopotamia.
I mean, I agree with you in part, but the thing is that, as Selena was saying, cuneiform, it goes between 3,500 years of history. So there are periods where cuneiform is extremely democratic, like the old Assyrian period is a great example. There, where the cuneiform system is really simplified and pared down and is very accessible to everybody. And then there are periods like the New Assyrian period where they go in a totally different direction. And every sign is given so many different meanings and so many different levels of meaning, as it were. So cuneiform can do both. It can go in sort of a vernacular direction where it can be used by many different people, or it can go into this very elitist direction. And that depends on the place and the time.
I think the elite will translate the epic from Sumerian to Akkadian language.
That's a good question. Selena?
I didn't quite hear what
He mentioned the elite. I think sometimes will translate some scholars, Babylonian scholars, who translated the epic from Sumerian language to Akkadian language.
Is that the leading there in that translation, or do you think that comes out of the problem?
It's very hard to say. It could be either. Really.
It could be either.
Yeah.
No, so I can give that question.
So whether it's
Is it written in Babylonian or is translation?
so whether the people who did the composition of the original Akkadian epic are drawing on Sumerian stories, is that an original elite context, or does it come out of a public?
Well, the Sumerian. But by the time that they're writing down the Sumerian version, people are not really speaking Sumerian anymore. They have to learn it as a second language.
Right.
So probably yes, by the time.
I think some scholars.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you would have to specifically go to school to learn Sumerian.
Yeah, fair enough.
So probably yes, by the time the Babylonian version was composed, Sumerian traditions would have been in the academic realm only, I would say. But then of course we have no idea what popular traditions might have also survived alongside it and fed into that process.
So would that be sort of like a Welsh text that is known well in English, but to go back to the origins, you have to learn Welsh. Is it similar?
Yeah, and I think part of the problem is that our sources are just biased towards the elites because the elites write, and that's part of the issue that when we know these cultures, we know them through their in part through their material remains, which gives us more sense of the everyday life, but we know them a lot through their writing, and the writing just gives us a very like specific outlook.
So now can we say this is a Sumerian version and this is a Akkadian version?
I think we can I think we can say there's a whole lot of versions. Like even within the Sumerian versions, you have different versions even within that, and then within the Akkadian version, you have
How different?
Well, the Sumerian and the Akkadian are quite different. Like for example, in the Sumerian, Enkidu is Gilgamesh's servant. In some texts we would even say slave, and he's a close servant, but still more. They're more. The hierarchy between them is more articulated, whereas in the Akkadian they're more lovers.
And there are also Sumerian stories about Gilgamesh that don't make it to the Akkadian version.
Yeah.
So there's a Sumerian story about the death of Gilgamesh, for instance, but paradoxically, the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't actually say anything about Gilgamesh's own death. The things that are left out as well.
But this is like a problem for the translator for this word.
Yeah.
Yeah. They translated from Sumerian or
So my version is based on the standard Babylonian, and so that's one of the Akkadians and one of the Akkadian versions. But there are parts in there are about 3/5 of the text that survive. But you can reconstruct part of the missing sections by using older versions. I don't use the Sumerian version because there are not any holes in the standard Babylonian that are well filled by the Sumerian. But there is a hole that is absolutely critical to the story, which is where Enkidu sees the gods deciding his death in a dream. And that only exists in the Hittite version, very frustratingly, because the Hittite version is very unlike the standard Babylonian version. So it's like having 4 jigsaw puzzles that sort of have the same picture, but you're stealing from the other jigsaw puzzles and it's like snipping them a bit in order to make the puzzle fit. And that is part of the Gilgamesh translation process.
I might just ask a question about MSR, because that was something, women's language, something that really interested me.
Yeah.
And I remember there's a German professor who's written about it. But I don't know if anyone else is interested in MSR. But as far as I can gather, no one really knows what it was. It could have been a refined form of speech or a soprano speaking voice, or a dialect, or a literary, construct. Or no one really knows. They have. There's a wonderful extract in. I think it's probably Samuel Noah Kramer. And it's a female fruit fly talking to a god and saying, eat my fruit and you will give my children a good home, or something extraordinary. But she says it in MSR.
Yeah.
Do you know Selena or?
Well, it's very debated, as you say, but the reason why it's being called this sort of women's language is because it's usually female characters in Sumerian poems that speak in this dialect, and then when it switches back to the main narrative, or when it switches back to a male voice, then they switch back to the standard Sumerian.
And I think of goddesses, but then again, you do mainly get female characters being goddesses.
Mainly goddesses, but then there's also this, there's a relatively new text recently been published, which is an argument between 2 women.
Yes, that's
who
right.
are sucking each other off, being terrible wives and terrible examples of womanhood, and they speak to each other in this dialect as well. I know. So, yes.
That's true. And it's also like MSR also becomes the language of lamentation. So these like beautiful, but also like heart-wrenching laments for destruction, which were meant to show the gods' greatness through the destruction that they can impose on humans. And that is also performed in MSL, even though it is performed by people who in other contexts appear as male. And so there has been an argument about whether they were in some way or other gender ambiguous. But you were putting together 2 very uncertain things. So that is difficult. And there is also another text called The Elevation of Ishtar, which is not the Exaltation of Ishtar, that is a slightly better known text. But The Elevation of Ishtar is a different text that uses MSL at random. But that is a text that also seems to be very consciously playing with gender in other ways. So, and there's some of the male gods speak MSL, which is like, what? So MSL is a very complicated question that is still fully understood.
And I mean, it could be a countertenor, a male countertenor voice.
It's possible.
No, if any of those possibilities, fascinating.
Yes.
Thank you for that presentation. Both the speaker and equally by the panelists. Doubting the only thing missing, I find, is the distinction between Sumerian, the language, which is extinct, and well, then those who could decipher it. If it is extinct, how did they decipher it? But from my little knowledge of history and languages is that it's the oldest, obviously, Mesopotamia, written in cuneiform, but I think it's also the only one is not a Semitic language or a Semitic language, and this has been read everywhere. It's read Babylonians and Akkadians are the same. They weren't the same. From little knowledge I have is that they were Indo-European or something, depending how far you go back into history. Some say they were Indo-European tribes at that time there, or when it's divided into European and Indo-Iranic, maybe it was, maybe they were Indic origin, or most probably the nearest one were Iranic, when it's divided between Indic and Iranic languages and peoples. They were Iranic physically. You know, they didn't come out from space. They weren't that advanced, and nobody believes that. So they were human beings, one of the tribes, depending on your history and how far you go back. So this distinction of Sumerians as non-Semitic or Indo-European or Iranic or Indic, whatever you call it, is important because all of them were translations into Akkadian and Babylonian and whatever other Semitic languages you have. So that is my only observation. It's not criticism, but just as a linguist, as identification of and distinction between Sumerian people and languages are called after their peoples, their speakers, and the rest of them, which are Semitic or Afro-Asiatic, whichever term you prefer. Thank you.
We have run out of time, so I'm going to very quickly respond, and then the panelists. But just to respond, there is no evidence as far as we know that there is no evidence as far as we know that Sumerian is an Indo-European language. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate, so it is not, as far as we can tell, related to any other known language. But there are a number of different language groups, language families present in Mesopotamia at any one time. Beside the Semitic and very Semitic languages like Akkadian, there are also languages like Hurrian, which also are like of unclear affinity. Besides, it is difficult to have an exact equation at this period in time between groups of people and languages. And the Akkadian and the Sumerian language is spoken side by side by much the same people. And people wouldn't necessarily have grown up thinking of themselves as a Sumerian speaker and a Akkadian speaker. They would have grown up thinking of themselves as a citizen of city X or Y or Z. And then they would have had different languages circulating at the same time and having different social functions. But we can debate that more over wine because it is now 8:30. So I want to thank Jenny, Walid, and Selena very, very much for this wonderful discussion about Gilgamesh. I really, really enjoyed it. And thank you all for coming. And yes, happy 150th anniversary to Gilgamesh.
Yes.